My name is Vincent Ellis, a self-confessed tech geek and reluctant chronicler of suburban absurdities. I call Emerald Park Residency home, a pristine haven governed by an overly persistent residents association, where the grass always seems artificially green and the cars outshine each other like showroom models. I work remotely as a software engineer and, typically, I avoid human contact before noon. Yet fate, it appears, had a different plan last week. Following a ferocious windstorm that shattered windows and led to a spate of burglaries, I made it my mission to secure every entry point of my modern, sleek house, a home I'd earned through blood, sweat, and countless late nights coding. As I double-checked the back window lock, I noticed her, a presence so unforgettable that I used the term her with the same mix of dread and dark humor that historians reserve for the darkest chapters of the past. There, in her immaculately kept garden, stood Julia Kensington, the self-appointed, and entirely unofficial, president of the Residents Association. Her reputation is legendary. She's as relentless with her pruning as she is with her enforcement of community standards. I watched, half amused and half appalled, as she meticulously trimmed her rose bushes with a ferocity normally reserved for disciplining neighborhood kids who dare to play after curfew. I paid her no mind, quickly locking the window and retreating to the comfort of my indoor sanctuary. But before I could settle back into my work, I was startled by a sound, a piercing, almost glass-shattering cry. "Excuse me. Excuse me, sir," came a voice so shrill it could have shattered my concentration entirely. I sighed inwardly, mustered the most polite, "I'm just trying to survive," smile on my face, and approached the commotion. "Good morning, Mrs. Kensington." "Lovely roses," I offered, clearly expecting small talk. But instead, I was met with fury. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice dripping with suspicion. "Locking your windows in broad daylight?" I blinked in bewilderment. "I'm securing my home after the recent break-ins. It's purely a safety precaution," I explained. But she didn't seem to register reason. With a dramatic flair that could rival any Broadway actor, she shrieked as if I'd confessed to performing dark rituals in my backyard. "This is Emerald Park Residency. We don't have crime here," she proclaimed. Yet, given the recent spate of burglaries, I couldn't fault her concern, but it was her manner that irked me. I started to turn away, hoping to retreat to my coding cave, when suddenly she whipped out her phone. "I'm calling the police. This is suspicious behavior," she screeched. I stood there, jaw-dropping in disbelief. 911 was being dialed because I was locking my windows. In that moment, I realized this would soon be the talk of the neighborhood. And perhaps even the evening news. I stood there, in my own yard, feeling the weight of disbelief press down on me. A minute ago, I was simply double-checking the locks on my sleek, modern home, trying to keep it secure after last week's string of burglaries in Emerald Park Residency. Now, I found myself gaping at Julia Kensington, who had just threatened to call the police on me for suspicious behavior. Her phone was already out, her voice pitched high enough to crack glass as she began to dial. The thought of a 911 call over me locking windows left my jaw hanging slack. "My name is Vincent Ellis. I work as a remote software engineer who generally minds his own business." But apparently, in the eyes of Julia, that quiet, midday lock-checking was a red flag for a community alarm. She insisted that I was causing a disturbance, claiming I must know something or be up to something. The irony was too thick to ignore. Emerald Park Residency had indeed suffered break-ins recently, precisely why I was being so vigilant. But reason and logic didn't appear to factor into Julia's worldview. As her shrill voice relayed to a dispatcher that a suspicious man was latching windows, my mind whirled with scenarios. Would the police show up with sirens blazing, expecting a full-blown criminal in action? I was no stranger to how quickly these interactions could turn sour, especially given that I was basically being labeled a threat by a self-important community figure. Then again, Julia was known to dial 911 over matters as trivial as kids biking after dark or neighbors who neglected their rose bushes. Still, the stakes felt uncomfortably high. Once it sunk in that the call was unstoppable, I decided there was one thing I could do: document the fiasco. I gently tugged out my phone and started recording. If something was going to escalate, I wanted proof of my innocence. The camera's lens captured Julia's outraged posture: pastel cardigan, gardening gloves stuffed in a back pocket, phone pressed to her ear, and eyes blazing with indignation. She looked more like someone on a mission to rid the world of unapproved window treatments than a stable community leader. What she didn't know was that my recording might be the least of her worries. While waiting for the inevitable arrival of the police, I tried to take my mind off the frustration by browsing the Residents Association website. Maybe I'd find a specific bylaw about window locking times or neighborhood pre-noon courtesy rules that I was supposedly violating. The site was a labyrinth of rules: lawn height maximums, holiday decoration timelines, authorized color palettes for front doors. It was comedic in its thoroughness. But comedic relief quickly turned into curiosity, and that curiosity became a wide-eyed revelation. Buried in a seldom visited section titled Financial Reports and Budgets, I unearthed a modest, unassuming spreadsheet. Its label read something like Association Beautification Expenses. Inside, I discovered a line item that made me do a double-take: Kensington Horticulture Reimbursement. The amounts listed were far from modest: thousands of dollars per month supposedly poured into community landscaping. That might not have been unusual in a large development, but Emerald Park Residency was relatively small, and the actual landscaping, beyond residents' private gardens, was minimal at best. I frowned, scanning row after row of suspicious charges. My software engineer brain quickly recognized patterns: repeated amounts, consistent intervals, all earmarked under the same account. I cross-referenced the listed horticulture business name with a quick online search. Surprise, surprise, Kensington Horticulture was registered to none other than Julia Kensington. So she was effectively reimbursing herself from association funds in the name of community beautification. The more I clicked and cross-checked, the more glaringly obvious it became: this was no minor oversight or petty misuse of funds. It was a systematic funneling of money into her personal account. A mild wind couldn't blow away the stench of embezzlement I was detecting. While that revelation sank in, a gnawing tension simmered in my chest. Because at any moment, the police would roll up. I'd have to defend myself against claims of suspicious window locking. But now I was armed with knowledge that the self-appointed queen of the Residents Association was siphoning off money. A question formed in my mind: should I try to explain all of this to the cops? Or wait until I had more solid evidence and let Julia bury herself with her own lies? It didn't take long for my hypothetical to turn into reality. The faint wail of sirens cut through the midday air, and within minutes, 2 police cruisers glided up to the curb. Their lights flickered across the well-tended lawns and meticulously maintained sidewalks of Emerald Park Residency, giving the usually tranquil street an unsettling disco effect. Each cruiser's door opened, and out stepped a pair of officers. One was a younger woman with a measured, cautious demeanor, and the other an older man who already looked tired of the drama. They approached me, scanning the scene for immediate danger. My phone was still in hand, capturing everything. "Sir, we received a call about suspicious activity. Could you step over here, please?" The older officer's tone was controlled, but the underlying caution was evident. He eyed me and then flicked a glance at Julia, who stood behind her rose bushes, arms folded like she was orchestrating a neighborhood coup. Meanwhile, the younger officer scanned my yard. Locked windows, no broken glass, no sign of forced entry. Suspicious? I echoed, adopting an incredulous tone. "I live here, officers. I was just locking my windows for security. After all, a few houses were broken into last week." Julia, not one to let reason stand in her way, immediately cut in. "That's exactly what's odd. Why lock them in the middle of the day if you're not expecting trouble? He's obviously planning something." She pointed accusingly, her face twisted with a triumphant "I told you so" smirk. The officers exchanged a subtle glance, the kind that says, "Oh, we know this type." Possibly, they'd dealt with Julia's baseless calls before. With a sigh, the younger officer turned to me. "Could you provide some ID? We just need to confirm you reside here, then we'll sort out Ms. Kensington's concerns." I nodded, pulling out my driver's license and explaining my remote job, the break-ins, and the fact that my routine midday check was just caution. While the older officer scrolled through notes, verifying my address, I spotted Julia's expression changing. She'd expected me to appear defensive or outraged, but I was surprisingly calm. Of course, I had a secret impetus for staying composed, those suspicious financial documents I'd just uncovered. If I let Julia rant long enough, she might reveal more than she intended. As if on cue, she launched into a rant about how crime was ramping up because of people like me. Her words verged on inflammatory, referencing that our once peaceful community is threatened by out-of-towners. The officer's exasperation was almost visible. Then, the older officer cleared his throat, returning my ID. "Everything seems in order, Mr. Ellis. Locking your windows isn't a crime." Julia's face contorted with frustration. "But he's making me feel unsafe. Isn't that enough for you to arrest him or at least do an official search?" The younger officer managed a polite but firm smile, shaking her head. "We only have your word that this is suspicious, Ms. Kensington, but we see no evidence of wrongdoing." That's when I made my move. "Officers," I said, slipping my phone into my pocket, "I appreciate your help. But since you're here, I stumbled upon something on the Residents Association website that might be worth looking into." My eyes flicked to Julia. The color drained from her cheeks. She knew. She absolutely knew what I'd found. I took a breath, deciding exactly how to phrase it. "I discovered some unusual reimbursements connected to Ms. Kensington's personal business. It appears quite a large sum of the association's money is being channeled into her own accounts." The older officer's brow furrowed. "Could you be more specific?" I explained in broad strokes that I'd found a spreadsheet detailing beautification reimbursements, which pointed back to a horticulture company registered under Julia's name. The officer's postures shifted, this was no longer a trivial matter. Julia, for her part, sputtered something about how I was invading her privacy and twisting the facts. But her tone had lost the confidence it held moments before. She sounded desperate, cornered. "Ms. Kensington," the younger officer said, "is there an explanation for these reimbursements?" Julia attempted to spin a story about administrative oversight and community improvement, but her words rang hollow. The officers were not fools, and the sequence of events, her calling them on a baseless complaint, me presenting evidence of potential embezzlement, tilted the scales heavily in my favor. The older officer exchanged a long look with his partner. "We might need you to step down to the station, Ms. Kensington, for some further clarification. Mr. Ellis, could you gather any relevant documentation you have?" Before I could reply, Julia burst into a frenzy, shouting that I was a liar, that I'd hacked the site, that she was the real victim here. But there was no real conviction behind her words, only panic. And so, in a surreal twist, the police that Julia had summoned to brand me a criminal ended up focusing their attention on her. I watched them escort her to a patrol car, not in cuffs but certainly not out of suspicion's glare. A crowd of neighbors had started to gather, drawn by the lights and the raised voices. Word spreads fast in Emerald Park, especially where scandal is concerned. A sense of calm, or maybe justice, settled over me as I realized how quickly the dynamic had changed. I didn't relish Julia's obvious terror, but then again, I felt no sympathy for her either. After all, she'd called the cops on me over something as benign as locking windows, while simultaneously siphoning association funds into her own pockets. And so ended the day that began with me fretting about break-ins and ended with Julia scrambling to defend herself against impending accusations of fraud. I might have simply locked my windows out of caution, but in the process, I'd unlocked a secret that would rock the entire Residents Association to its core. After the police arrived and I managed to calm the situation regarding my simply secured windows, I retreated to the side of my porch with my phone still recording. I needed to document every detail of this absurd episode, because in Emerald Park Residency nothing ever goes unnoticed for long. While the officers verified that locking my windows wasn't a crime, I quietly opened the Residents Association website on my tablet, hoping for a distraction. Scrolling through the endless labyrinth of regulations, I eventually stumbled upon a section labeled Financial Reports and Budgets. Curiosity piqued, I clicked on a folder entitled Association Beautification Expenses. There, among pages of minutiae about turf, holiday lights, and community signage, was an item that immediately caught my eye: Kensington horticulture reimbursements. The spreadsheet showed astronomical sums, thousands of dollars sent monthly for what was described as community landscaping improvements. As a software engineer with a knack for pattern recognition, I immediately sensed something was off. The reported expenses far exceeded what one could reasonably expect from a modestly maintained community garden. My suspicion only deepened when I noticed that the landscaping contractor's name was curiously similar to the Residents Association president's own business. I couldn't resist. I fired up Google and, using a secure VPN, searched for the company name. Sure enough, all public business records indicated that Kensington Horticulture was registered to none other than Julia Kensington. A gasp escaped me as the full implication became clear: Julia, who prided herself on enforcing every minor community rule with hawk-like precision, was funneling association funds straight into her own pocket. This wasn't merely a Karen moment. It was a full-blown embezzlement scheme waged under the guise of community beautification. My mind raced with the possibilities. Could this fraud be linked to a pattern of targeting residents like me? And how many unsuspecting homeowners might have already been taken in by her facade of righteous vigilance? Before I could close the tab, the distant wail of sirens sounded again. Although the police had already arrived regarding the window-locking debacle, I knew that once financial wrongdoing reared its head, the stakes would only escalate. I quickly saved all the financial documents and screenshots onto a secure folder on my phone. If any further action were needed, I now had evidence that could tip the scales. Just then, the officers returned. The older officer, a seasoned man with kind but skeptical eyes, asked if I'd discovered anything unusual while waiting. I casually mentioned that during my routine check on the Residents Association site, I'd stumbled upon discrepancies in the beautification budget. The mention of Kensington horticulture reimbursements and its astronomical figures caused the officer to lean in, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to alarm. "Is that true?" he asked in a hushed tone, as if every word might ignite further scandal. I nodded, handing over my phone. The young officer scrolled through the images with a growing frown. "Sir, this appears to be a textbook case of embezzlement," she murmured. "I wish you had come forward sooner." At that moment, I could almost feel the gears of justice turning. The evidence was incontrovertible: Julia Kensington had been misusing funds, and now the police had reason to investigate a federal-level fraud, not merely a case of a suspicious man locking his windows. I maintained my calm as the officers promised to file a report and request further investigation into the Residents Association's finances. Despite the chaos of the afternoon, I couldn't help but feel that I had inadvertently uncovered a much larger story, a story that might just bring about real accountability in our carefully manicured yet deeply flawed community. I watched as Julia, her face now a mask of panic and disbelief, was gently escorted toward a patrol car. Her earlier bravado had evaporated in an instant upon learning that I held the evidence of her financial misdeeds. In that moment, I realized that sometimes even the smallest action, a cautious lock on a window, can trigger a cascade of revelations. As the police gathered statements and secured the electronic records, I stayed by the side of my doorstep, contemplating how one man's defense of his privacy had uncovered the hidden corruption lurking beneath the polished facade of Emerald Park Residency. I knew the days ahead would be turbulent for our community. With the evidence now officially in the hands of law enforcement, the fall of the tyrannical enforcement of community rules was imminent. And I, Vincent Ellis, Mitchell Caldwell, as introduced in Part 1, would be ready to face whatever came next. For now, however, I allowed myself a brief moment of satisfaction, knowing that truth had started to crack the surface of a decades-long facade of suburban perfection. The fallout from the discovery of the fraudulent landscaping reimbursements rippled through Emerald Park Residency like a shockwave. By the next day, word had spread among neighbors, and what began as hushed whispers turned into outright anger. A special meeting of the Residents' Association was convened, one that no one expected to be quite as explosive as the evidence in my hands. On the morning of the meeting, I made my way to the community center with a mix of apprehension and determination. I wasn't sure how this would all play out, but I knew that revealing the corruption had to be done in a manner that restored trust and accountability among the residents. The center was a large, sterile hall adorned with the signature meticulous decor of Emerald Park, but today it felt charged with tension and anticipation. Inside, a cluster of residents had gathered. Their faces ranged from anxious to irate, and many clutched copies of the community newsletter that had begun to circulate the scandalous news. At the front of the room, Julia Kensington, once the imperious and unyielding president, now looked visibly nervous. Her posture was slumped as she fumbled with a stack of documents that were probably meant to defend her actions. A moderator, likely someone from the interim board, tried to restore order by announcing the purpose of the meeting, to address complaints regarding financial mismanagement and alleged misuse of association funds. I took my seat near the front, my eyes fixed on Julia. I knew that the evidence I had gathered would not only expose her wrongdoing but would also serve as a catalyst for change in a community long plagued by the heavy-handed enforcement of outdated rules. As the moderator began the proceedings, voices in the room grew louder, with residents sharing personal anecdotes of harassment and inequity. Many recounted how minor infractions were blown out of proportion, how a single unapproved flower vase led to hefty fines, all to maintain a facade of perfection. At one point, an elderly lady from the neighborhood, her voice trembling with anger, stood up and said, "We trusted this board to protect our community, but all they've done is enrich themselves." The room erupted into murmurs of agreement. Julia's eyes darted nervously from one face to another. It was clear that her authority, once unquestioned, was crumbling under the weight of the facts. After the initial round of accusations, the moderator called for any official responses from the board. Julia attempted a feeble defense, citing administrative oversights and insisting that the reimbursements were for quality enhancement. But her words fell flat against the undeniable numerical evidence. I could see several residents quietly exchanging knowing glances. It was as if they had been waiting for this moment all along. The moderator then announced that the board had commissioned an independent audit of the association's finances, an audit whose preliminary findings aligned almost perfectly with my own discoveries. Gasps and murmurs of disbelief filled the hall. It appears that nearly all the funds allocated for community beautification have been siphoned off into a personal account, the moderator read aloud from the report. The amount totals to a figure that is utterly staggering for a community of this size. At that point, the room's atmosphere shifted dramatically from one of indignation to one of vindication. Residents who had felt powerless now exuded a sense of renewed hope. Several individuals began discussing plans to reform the association's policies and implement stricter oversight. In a dramatic turn, the interim board announced that, pending further investigation, Julia Kensington's membership in the association would be suspended and that she would be replaced by a more transparent leadership structure. I couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction. Finally, in Emerald Park Residency, the days of unchecked authority and discriminatory practices were coming to an end. The meeting lasted for several hours, with heated debates, impassioned speeches, and even a few tears. By the end, a new constitution for the Residents' Association was proposed, one that emphasized accountability, equitable treatment, and active resident participation. As I left the community center that day, I marveled at the transformation unfolding around me. The once dominant aura of repression that had defined our neighborhood was now giving way to open dialogue and genuine reform. I knew that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges and likely legal battles, but in that moment, hope shone brightly. And as I walked home beneath a sky tinged with the colors of dusk, I couldn't help but smile at the thought that sometimes, a single act of vigilance can ignite a revolution, even in a place as meticulously manicured as Emerald Park Residency.